Chicago's incumbent mayor, Lori Lightfoot, recently lost her re-election bid last month, making her the first mayor in several decades to lose re-election after serving only one term. Now, fallout over Lightfoot's response to Chicago's crime wave was to blame. And now, two remaining candidates, Paul Vallis, who has been endorsed by the police unions, and Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson, will face off in the runoff election on April 4th. Joining us now to talk about the race is the current Cook County Commissioner and Chicago mayoral candidate, Brandon Johnson. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, it's clearly my honor to be with you all. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, look, before we get into the big topic of crime, because that really has been front and center in this race, I did want to just touch on what Mayor Lightfoot said in a recent interview after she had lost her re-election bid. When a reporter asked her if she had been treated unfairly, she said, quote, "I'm a black woman in America, of course," which I thought was a strange thing to say considering one of the candidates for the runoff election is a black man and she was elected into office just 4 years ago. Did the electorate in Chicago change that significantly?
You know, what happened here in the city of Chicago is, quite frankly, it's a remarkable testament to our movement. The truth of the matter is that, Mayor Lori Lightfoot 4 years ago ran on a whole bunch of promises that she had committed to those who have been tethered to real economic, racial, and social justice in the city of Chicago. And so everything from educational justice, environmental justice, again, housing justice, these are all promises that she ran on. And then she reneged on those promises and broke every last single one of them. And so really it's more of a reflection of the sentiment and the mood of the residents of the city of Chicago, that clearly residents of the city of Chicago want a progressive voice representing the interest of working people, middle class families, those struggling in poverty. There's a tremendous amount of disappointment because unfortunately, she was not as tethered to the movement as people had hoped. And because she wasn't as tethered to the movement, she was not obligated to actually live out those promises. And we've turned the page and we're prepared to move forward now.
Right, and one thing I'll say before I go to Cenk, one of the things that I've been seeing in the press in regard to feedback, criticism about her leadership is allegedly her progressive policies have led to a spike in crime, but she was anything but progressive in terms of her response to crime. In fact, she bolstered the police budget. I think Chicago has one of the highest police budgets in the country, over $1 billion if I remember correctly. But I just wanted to give that note to the audience before I toss to Cenk.
Okay, so I'm a little confused by Chicago, and I think the whole country is. And so I'm hopefully looking for guidance here. So number one, you've got more cops per capita than LA, which is not hard, but more than New York, which is hard, right?
Yeah.
And so, and crime has gone up all across the nation in cities that cut policing, added policing, you name it, right? So, but Chicago persists in being above the rest in crime. So I can't figure it out. What is going on there that you think is causing this higher than average crime spike in Chicago?
Well, look, it's a very serious problem. First of all, the crime in the city of Chicago, unfortunately, has really gone on unaddressed for a very long time. And my wife and I, we're raising our children in the Austin community. It's a community on the west side of the city of Chicago, and it's a beautiful community. We love living here, and it is one of the more disinvested communities. And as a result of that, it is a more violent neighborhood. In fact, it is one of the most violent neighborhoods in the entire city. So, I have the greatest incentive, particularly in this race, for the city of Chicago to be better, stronger, and safer. But what has happened over the course of decades is that there's been the defunding of our public schools, the defunding of public housing, the defunding of public transportation, healthcare, access to good paying jobs, while there's been an emphasis in protecting those with means. And so the ultra rich and billionaires and millionaires, of course, continue to benefit from the largesse of this economy. And families like mine and families across the city have been left behind. And that old style of politics, which the people of Chicago are actually tired of, are prepared and ready to embrace something new. And that is why there's so much excitement around my candidacy. The last thing that I'll say is, to your point, we spend more money per capita in terms of law enforcement, policing, than anywhere else in the country. And it has not resulted into a safer city. And that has an awful lot to do with, one, there's no plan. Two, that we do not have like the emphasis of investment in the city of Chicago. And three, we haven't had the type of leadership that understands the complexity of the city of Chicago. And that's what I bring to this context and to this race. And that's what I'm confident that my leadership will ultimately bring to the fifth floor.
Well, to your point about police funding, what has been incredibly frustrating, for me at least, is just seeing the conversation stay on the topic of like the amount of money as opposed to how the money is spent and whether there is effective policing, right? So it's not about the number of cops or how much money you're funneling into the police departments. It's about whether or not the policing is effective, and clearly it's not effective, right? Whether you're talking about a place that temporarily defunded the police and then refunded the police, whether you're talking about a place like Chicago that never defunded the police, in fact, only continued to increase the police budget, you're seeing the same trends. There's obviously something broken with policing, but you keep talking about a holistic approach. So I wanna kind of take a step back. Tell us what your response, your holistic response to the crime wave would be.
Yeah, I just want to highlight the fact that the police budget is almost $2 billion. Just,
I thought so, yeah.
For clarity, but to your point though, that amount of money has not translated into safer communities. And as I said, I live in Austin, is one of the greatest concentration of Black residents anywhere in the country. And combined over the last 4 years, there are more homicides in the neighborhood in which I'm raising my family than neighborhoods combined in the more safer, so-called safer communities that are obviously more white and more affluent. So, to your point or your question around a holistic approach, you have to have smart policing. I mean, the fact of the matter is, one, we're not solving any crimes in the city of Chicago. Our clearance rate is absolutely abysmal. 25% of crimes are actually being solved in the city of Chicago. And so that's why my approach, because I have the ability to do this as mayor of the city of Chicago, we're going to train and promote 200 more detectives. We can do that. This is what many people are calling for in the city of Chicago, to make sure that we are actually engendering actual confidence in the city of Chicago. If we can't solve crime, it's going to be very difficult for us to actually have a safer city. But two, we're going to actually implement with all expediency the consent decree. The consent decree on a very baseline is calling for just more research in our institutions to provide platforms for the type of policies that actually have to be implemented in order for us to be a safer city. Three, we have red flag laws on the books, right? These are laws that are not even being enforced. So people who have guns that should not have guns are still getting on the streets. It's very juxtaposition to my opponent, who is supported by an ultra billionaire who is connected to Citadel, and their entire project is to produce more guns and put more guns on the street. But here's the important part. We also have to get at the root causes of violence in the city of Chicago. There's a policy that I'm going to pass within the first 100 days of my administration. It's called treatment, not trauma. It's going to provide EMT, social workers, mental health crisis professionals on the front line to respond to ultimately 40% of the 911 calls. 40% of the 911 calls that come through are actual mental health crises calls. And so we are asking officers to attempt to do their job, right? Mm-hmm. While also asking them to do someone else's job by freeing them up to actually focus on where the more violent crimes actually take place, and putting EMT and social workers and counselors on the front line. That in and of itself will solve some of the dynamics that we're experiencing in Chicago.
So let me jump in on that because that is a proposal that has played out in other parts of the country, including Los Angeles. So one of my closest friends, my best friend, is a social worker herself, and I'm curious. Has there been any conversation with social workers, any questions in regard to whether or not they want to do this? I feel like they get volunteered, but no one, whether it be political candidates or officials within any given county, they don't reach out to them and talk to them. There's no additional resources provided to them. And then they're expected to respond to calls with individuals who are allegedly having a non-violent mental health episode. But sometimes it is violent. They're not getting paid extra for it. You know, there's all sorts of issues and questions that don't get answered ahead of time. And I think when you consider the workload that social workers are already dealing with, the insanely low pay social workers are receiving, it makes this question a little more complicated. So have you at all, looked into those issues?
I have, in fact, so I've served as a public school teacher in the city of Chicago. I've served on the front line and teaching in those disinvested communities that I've already described. And so what we have found is not just social workers and counselors, it's also EMT professionals, but it's also crisis intervention specialists, right? There are individuals with lived experiences that have the type of training to de-escalate restorative justice practices. There are a whole host of dynamics and professionals that of course we will involve in the actualization of this particular ordinance and law, but there are some pilot districts around the city that we've already begun to implement. So this is not far stretched, and thank you for highlighting Los Angeles, because we've been sharing that document around the city, that you have the Los Angeles Police Department agreeing with the brother who's running for mayor in the city of Chicago. Now look, it's gonna take some time, of course, to make sure that it's implemented, not just with expediency, but with care and sophistication. But the bottom line is this: if over 40% of your calls, or nearly 40% of your calls, are mental health crises, we have to adjust to the question that you raised about what smart policing looks like. Here's the other dynamic that's important to note. Over 40% of the violent crimes that occur in the city of Chicago, it takes place in 6% of the city. We already know where there's a greater proclivity for the type of violence to occur, and it shouldn't be a coincidence or a surprise to anyone. Of course, the 6% of the communities are overwhelmingly Black and brown and poor communities that have been disinvested in. So this is about smart policing, but it also requires us to open up our mental health centers. The previous administration, under Rahm Emanuel's administration, I was a part of the movement that pushed back against him closing mental health centers, but I also fought this outgoing administration because she refused to reopen them, a promise that she made and a promise that she broke. And so it's a holistic approach. The last thing that I'll say is this too: I'm gonna double the amount of young people that we hire in the city of Chicago. There's a direct correlation between youth employment and violence reduction. And then we're gonna make them year-round positions. And I've looked into the eyes of young people who have been disinvested in, who feel less hope because they don't feel valued. Under my administration, someone who's been a teacher, an organizer, and a Cook County commissioner, someone who's been responsible for multi-billion-dollar budgets, I am confident that our investments in young people is the greatest return we can ever anticipate, because that's what safe American cities do around the country. They actually invest in people. That's what I'm gonna do as mayor.
Okay, I want to ask one more question. So we're talking to Brandon Johnson. He's running for mayor in Chicago. There's only 2 candidates left now, and he's the more progressive of the two, very clearly so. So Brandon, to me, the number one issue in policing is the culture of policing. And that is a very tough thing to handle, right? So the culture affects several different things. One is the police abuse that we see sometimes, but it's not just that, right? So you've got the cops that target certain areas of town. It happens in every city, right? And they usually have a very rough way of handling things. And at the same time, though, they're not really solving crime. They're just there and they're doing stop and frisk, which the community perceives accurately so as basically picking on them. But the second part nobody ever talks about, they barely ever solve crimes. We have both problems, but if you go to tell the cops, hey, you guys aren't really solving that many crimes and you're busting heads, and the busting the heads doesn't work. I want policing, I want safety, but I want you to do it in a rational way, and that's a little harder. You're gonna have to work harder, you're gonna have to, et cetera. That is not going to be well received by the cops. They will hate you for saying that. So how do you solve that problem?
Well, look, I think the bottom line is that I'm glad that you actually highlighted the history of policing, and particularly here in Chicago. We had over 100 men, mostly Black men, who have been exonerated because they were tortured and forced into false confessions. And look, I'm a social studies teacher. There's no secret of the history of policing in this country. It has been used as a tool that is deeply tethered, of course, in slavery. And so having those honest conversations is something that I have done as a Cook County commissioner, as a teacher, as an organizer. We've developed curriculum around the nasty past of policing in the city. look, you're not going to be able to solve this dynamic or bring real restorative justice if we're not being honest about how we got here. And when you have an opponent who is supported by the FOP, their leadership, who was supportive of the January 6th insurrection, that does provide a great deal of trepidation and concern within our communities. And so here's what I'm also confident in, though. I have served on the front line as a public school teacher. And when you show up to work every single day in some of the most difficult situations, doing your job as a teacher, but also being asked to do someone else's job as a social worker or a counselor or therapist, that type of burden is what has caused like a tremendous disruption within police relationships. And then this is why the consent decree is important, because implementing the consent decree will move us closer towards providing restorative dynamics within law enforcement and communities. And if I can just be even that much more blunt, is that, look, Black folks, brown folks call police more than most communities. And when they show up, there's some trepidation there simply because there's a dynamic that we have to be honest about and work towards restoration. And I'm committed to that. The other dynamic that I think is important to note, we have law enforcement, rank and file police officers who do not know who their supervisor is every day. I mean, we have supervisors who supervise the supervisor. That's like me showing up as a teacher. My principal is different every other day. How do you create a level of trust and accountability if we have not even figured out like who you're reporting to? So I know that's a very like loaded response, but it's the type of complete holistic approach that I'm going to bring to this dynamic and this conversation, and I'm prepared and willing to lead it.
Brandon Johnson, he is running for mayor in Chicago. If you're a Chicagoan, definitely check out his campaign. The runoff election is on April 4th. Brandon Johnson, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.